Hello and welcome to another instalment of the Wyfutbol podcast with me, Michael Dryden, and Etches Adokru. Before we start, please follow us on Twitter at Yfootball_ and subscribe with us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, and YouTube. This episode is another instalment of The Chats, our second instalment of this series. So, Etches, hello.
Hey, Jordan, how you doing? You all right?
Yeah, I'm not bad. I've just seen Leeds thump West Brom 5-0. Pretty resounding display.
Yeah, I think the best performance of tonight was Arsenal versus Brighton. Real battle down in the relegation spots. Um, End-to-end
Definitely.
football, top quality performance all around from Arsenal. No, it's actually really boring. Um, and I think the one bit moment of quality in the game, Arsenal scored for Lacazette, and Arsenal go marching on. I feel for Graham Potter's Brighton a little bit. I thought they played quite well, which is unfortunate. But yeah, no, I actually missed the whole of the West Brom game. So I saw Leeds. I was watching out for Bamford because of fantasy. He did get 2 assists. I don't have him in my team, so I'm a bit concerned by that. This week's episode of the chat, we're going to talk all about Timo Werner's struggles, kind of looking at why he's come in to the Premier League and what was expected of him, why it hasn't worked out so far, and are we being unfair?
Mm.
We often talk about foreign imports in the Premier League and assume, oh, if X is doing very well here, when he comes to Y, he will also be very good. And it's not always as easy
Yep.
as it may look. So to kind of kick things off, I kind of wanted to go back in time to, well, actually the summer where Timo Werner moved to Chelsea. It was for around £45 million because his release clause was met. I think we actually had a guest on who was discussing how he'd fit in at Liverpool ages
Yeah.
ago and how that would work out, and he was kind of the hot property of the time. When you spend that sort of money, which is a big chunk, no matter what side you are, you're expecting similar returns to what he delivered at Leipzig, and he was pretty lethal there goals wise. So, what did you kind of expect from Timo Werner? Was it more of like you saw him as someone that could grow into the league, or was he already kind of the star that was supposed to arrive and absolutely destroy defenses week after week?
Well, more the latter, you'd say. He's 24 now, which, he's still got time to grow and to build on potential even further. But yeah, I'd say the latter. I mean, last season, I've got the stats up here, 34 Bundesliga appearances, 28 goals. And so I kind of expected to see him hit the ground running. But I suppose as we'll go on and discuss a bit further, a bit later, it's a very different system. And so it was, and he's come into a Chelsea team, right, that has had so much talent come in. I think everyone was kind of scratching their head a little bit, wondering how would the Chelsea team do at the start of the season. So much talent came in. We had Havertz come in, we had Ziyech come in, even players like Thiago Silva, Chilwell, Mendy eventually came in, and the whole team is revamped. And there's still some folks in there like Mount and Abraham who are mainstays from last season, season before, who are there doing well at the moment. But it's such an overhaul.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Of all the signings that Chelsea made, I think the ones which carried the most fuss were himself and Havertz, naturally because they're attacking players. Ziyech as well, but Ziyech was actually signed a few months before that, wasn't
Mm.
he, on like a
Yeah.
pre type of deal. So there was a lot of hype around Werner. I remember I've watched him quite a few times. He didn't actually always sparkle when I watched him, but I could see the talent that was there. Obviously, his pace is extremely threatening, especially when he is through on goal or is given the space to do so, and he works quite well off like a tall type of target man striker like Paulson at Leipzig, and
Yeah,
he was
definitely, yeah.
quite devastating. Obviously, we kind of moving on to like the next point, which is why hasn't it worked out? And I think it's a really tough one to kind of answer. I also feel fans love someone. If fans love to see a player that's not on their team do badly, just naturally. So I think people also form assumptions extremely quickly. So I saw a tweet not long ago from a really big Chelsea account, or was it no Man United account, which was saying it's mad that Havertz is already on his way to becoming a Premier League flop. And I remember I was looking at the games that Havertz has played, or even Werner, and they must be under 20. And it's just so interesting how football Twitter, which is what I like to call it, or the Twitter mob, of decide on a player within games when, there are some famous examples of players in the past that have taken a season, 18 months to really settle and have then flourished into the fantastic players that we know them as. But specifically looking at why Werner hasn't worked out, it's kind of like a change of system and like a change of team, right?
Yeah,
So you look at how Chelsea play. One, he's playing wide. I know there are a lot of people out there that will say, "Oh, but he used to play wide, etc., etc." But
yeah,
from when I saw him when he was prolific, he's playing through the middle, and I think that's kind of been tricky for him. When I've watched him, he seems that his confidence has dropped a little bit, which happened. You don't score, but he just seems rushed. I watched him in the Arsenal game in particular.
yeah,
The kind of what I'm trying to say is when you have a ball in a certain area and you're Harry Kane, Messi, Ronaldo, Suarez, and his prime Lewandowski, you really don't want that player to shoot from there because you know it's going to go in, or you have a strong feeling it's danger.
yeah.
With Timo Werner now, especially when we played them the other day, and also against Leeds, I just felt like he's just not going to do it. I know in the end he actually got an assist in the Leeds game, I believe, but I just don't. He doesn't have that fear factor.
When he's playing for Chelsea against Villa, or he's playing against Chelsea against another side who are particularly playing at the low block, he's getting the ball kind of, that space like just inside the box or even just on the line of the penalty area or just
Yeah.
outside the box. And he's getting the ball in there. He's got Chilwell wide, so Werner's not expected to be wide. And he's come back on his right foot, and he's got literally got like three players in front of him, and he's trying to get that shot away. He's trying to think of kind of how to react to that situation. Whereas when he was perhaps going through with Leipzig and had more space, he was to an extent already knew what he had to do. He was kind of probably systematic, and he just he applied that kind of Jimmy Vardy finish. He's kind of like Jimmy Vardy sort of player.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The method seems to be at Chelsea, from when I've watched them, like a 4-3-3-ish type of thing, where the wide players kind of tuck in. So, you have, if Mount is wide, he cuts in. The idea is that Werner does the same, and because he's on his right foot, he's going to hit it and it's going to go in. And then you've got the fullbacks around the outside. I think from when I've actually seen him, though, as you said, he's having issues with actually finding actual space. Whereas at Leipzig, it's a complete different system. The width isn't really supplied by him; it's supplied by the wing backs, and we know how much everyone loves Angelino. For
Yeah, yeah,
and from where we see Werner, it's obviously much more central, and as you said, coming from deep. Yeah, you mentioned the Southampton game. The two goal, I think he got two goals, but the one goal I remember that he did score was the one where he literally ran from deep, and then it's kind of poor defending, but it was so instinctive for him, where he's got down, beat a man, used his pace, then got a shot off, and then scored. Um, and I thought that was kind of the turning point. Where I thought, oh, we're going to really see him. I missed some of the in between games, and he seems to have been shipped back out wide, but he just seems so
yeah.
ineffective there.
And it's no surprise that he got them two goals against a Hasenhüttl side that does like to play high as well. So I just kind of, illustrates the point that playing against a low block, it's difficult for any forward, playing against, you've watched Man City against Newcastle at the weekend, or I think it was Boxing Day. Um, they've got a wealth of attacking talent. They had Ferran Torres playing Sterling, Kevin De Bruyne, and they found it difficult to break Newcastle down because when teams are playing with a flat back five or they've got a holding midfielder in there, it's not easy to break these teams down, and you've got to really nick a goal early doors so that they then come out from their shell kind of thing and you can get in behind them. Um, yeah, and you mentioned how we had Lee Scott as a guest quite a few number of episodes ago. He talked about how Chelsea potentially, sorry, Liverpool had came in for Werner or potentially could go there. I do wonder if perhaps he could have fared better at a Liverpool side. I mean, perhaps we're being too quick to kind of judge Werner already at Chelsea. He's only played 16 Premier League games. But perhaps in a team like Liverpool, which might be a bit more like Leipzig in the sense that they do try and create chaos by by pressing, counter pressing, by winning the ball back in areas that then does create chaos with an opposition defence. You saw um, Liverpool against Palace, and had Timo Werner been in a game like that, perhaps we would see him flourish and score goals because they do open up defences in a way that perhaps Chelsea don't.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think it's really hard to play for a team like Liverpool, but I think because Liverpool are so good, it's also quite easy at the same time.
Mm.
Sometimes you say, "Oh, if da 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 played for Liverpool, he'd look really good." It's like, no, because I don't think he has a skill set to play for Liverpool. But I get the point that when you're a machine like Liverpool that steamrolls most sides, even this season when they've had their problems, it is a bit easier than, let's say, if you want to play for Arsenal at the moment, and it's a bit like, well, it's not it's not as easy to play for Arsenal potentially as someone like Liverpool. And I do agree. It kind of moves on to the next point, which is, are we being unfair or unrealistic? I think too often players are just seen as robots. So, as I said before, you're very good in X League. Now you've come to Y League. You should be very good because you did this at X. And actually, the complexity around it is quite mad.
Mm.
From different systems, different managers, different leagues, different atmosphere. You don't actually know what goes on with the player. So we're looking at someone like Timo Werner. We've spoken about systems as well, but not just that. Chelsea could be working under someone like Lampard's. It may not be as easy as someone like Nagelsmann. And it's the broader point of how long should it take a foreign player to settle in England?
Mm.
So that's kind of the first kind of question I wanted to pose to you. So I think often the term is 1 year. People always say you got 12 months and then 12 months is up and then you have to deliver. Um, and yeah, I'm, I would say 12 to 18 months, but I think beyond that, you're probably running out of time.
You'd have to be hitting the ground running perhaps in your second season, and if you're not, then to an extent, I mean, how long can you're essentially learning on their time, right? So how long do you get? And because a team like Chelsea, for example, they have spent money on Werner, they spent money on other areas of the pitch. They can't afford to let if every single one of those players is afforded 2 seasons. That's just gonna Lampard won't be there for too long. So, but then, as you say, every player is different. Chilwell's hit the ground running. He hasn't come from a different country, but Thiago Silva's done well. Eduard Mendy's hit the ground running. Ziyech has done well when he's been there. Some players just, it's easier for them to adapt. A player like Ziyech, for example, he's Moroccan, I believe. He's then went to Holland. He's already got experience of applying his trade in different countries. Perhaps it's a bit easier for him to come and settle in a bit quicker. It's going to be difficult for Chelsea because you can't, even as I said, 2 seasons is a lot. Even 1 season, even half a season. If in half a season all those players don't completely settle in and embed and perform, the team is going to be, isn't going to be performing, and it has to happen right away for some of them players.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Football, a really good example is Real Madrid. Real Madrid, you honestly have, I think, a season, all the backing from the president, and then you're gone. There's so many players I could list
Mm.
that have had fantastic careers, but didn't necessarily sparkle as much as they did at Madrid, from Higuain to Van der Vaart to Huntelaar to Schneider to
Yeah,
there's so many players I could reel off that are brilliant, brilliant individuals that maybe played their part at Real Madrid, but tended to sparkle once they moved on because the expectation is so high and it's expected so quickly. You hear rumors of Barcelona wanting Dembele to leave, and yet he was one of the most expensive players of all
mm.
time. And I think that's kind of this adaptation period, you know, is it too short? Because we're saying a season, or you're saying the impact has to be immediate, but fans expect so much more so soon because with that, it's attributed to price.
Yeah,
So, if Werner was free, that's always part of the argument, which is, it was a free signing, so it doesn't cost Chelsea anything. But when it's 72 million like Nicolas Pepe, when it's 72 or 70 million for Kepa, it's continuously drilled into you that,
yeah, of
because
course, yeah.
the price is higher, they must deliver immediately.
Yeah, you've also got that kind of resale element as well. Like the longer they flop at your club,
Yeah.
the more their value is going to diminish. Whereas if you do kind of shit them on after a year or so, perhaps if they aren't doing so well, I mean, Kepa is a brilliant example of a player that is arguably his Chelsea career is over, and he cost an absolute fortune for his position. Unprecedented for a goalkeeper, really, for someone who came from Bilbao, I believe, and hadn't really played like great deal of Champions League football. But for his position, that is a lot of money. So it's difficult. I think it's difficult to give a definitive answer of how long a player should adapt on the pitch, but then there's so much going around that, isn't it? I mean, players react differently to moving us overseas, to settling their families, to everything that goes around that, to settling in with the squad, to potentially bring, do they come on their own? Do they bring their families over? It's such a there's so many factors around a player moving from one country to another to settling in, and it doesn't matter if he's coming. People might say, "Oh, he's coming from Germany. He probably speak English."
Yeah.
He might have a good. It's easier for him than say someone coming from Martinelli coming from Brazil to London, for example. Perhaps you could say it's easier uh, for someone like Werner to do so. But it's naive because everyone's different, and people have different backgrounds, and so if You don't know who. I don't know if Werner's come across with his family. I don't know who he's brought across with him, if he has at all. And if he hasn't settled off the pitch, it's unlikely he's going to settle on the pitch.
So how did Sunderland help Asamoah Gyan settle?
Oh god, that's a brilliant question. We could be here all night. Well, he didn't settle that well because he left after a season to go to Dubai, but he did quite well though. I mean, that was a for a club like us to bring in a player who's actually a star of that 2010 World Cup for Ghana, and to bring him in straight after the World Cup, I thought was a bit of a coup, really. Um, but he he didn't seemingly enjoy playing for us as much as we enjoyed seeing him play for us, and he left to go to Al Ain after a season. But that's a good example, though. Sunderland are a good example of it. You've not just got players coming across, and obviously we're talking about Timo Werner here, but you've got player that might come across to the UK from somewhere in Europe, somewhere in South America, somewhere wherever. It's one thing them going to London, one of the biggest cities in the world, metropolitan, highly multicultural. You think about then a player coming across and settling in the UK, for example, in another town. So I read on Twitter today, actually, quite interesting. It's quite an interesting anecdote. I think it was in the Athletic, actually, about Man City when they go into negotiations with a player. They show this player that
Mm.
the weather in Manchester is not actually, in terms of like average rainfall, any worse than London, because obviously, as a stereotype, Manchester's got bad rain, bad weather. And so then obviously they come across about, I don't want to play in the rain. I don't want to play. It was that story about, and apparently Antoine Griezmann didn't want to come to Manchester because it was too cold. I don't buy that because it gets cold in Spain.
But
But
does it?
it does, yeah, it
Ah,
does.
okay, but thanks for sharing, mate. Thank you for sharing. If you can take anything away from this episode, is that it does get cold in Spain, in case you're wondering. Um, but no, you make a good point. That I read that article as well, and the reason why it made me laugh so much is someone, as part of their job, has to go out and on Google, wherever it may be, to then produce charts or graphics, or even if it's information, to prove to a potential player, that the weather is not much worse. The weather is better in Manchester, London. Like, just think about that for a second. Like, imagine you're Terry in, I don't know what it'd be, the negotiations team. It's like, right, Terry, you need to go and like give me some stats about the weather in Manchester and prove to this player
Sorry.
that it's not worse than London. Like, that in itself is quite funny. Um, but yeah, I think the next kind of point is, we're talking about how players settle, and I think it kind of falls down into three things, which is club, system, and the player themselves. So system is like, you know, Messi is one of the best players in the world, but I'm not too sure Tony Pulis would get the best out of him.
He just got sacked today, to be fair. So I mean,
He
probably
did
not.
45 days in the job as well. That is actually bonkers. 45 days. And mate, you're still unboxing like your right move boxes in your wherever you were staying, and then you just get the boot, which is not very
Well,
nice.
pay for next Christmas, so he'd probably be quite happy, old Tony.
Oh, I don't think anyone's happy they're getting sacked. But you know what I mean?
No, but it's the stigma behind these, like, the stigma behind these kind of matches, these like firefighter managers like Pulis and Sam Allardyce, where everyone assumes like Allardyce that he's come to West Brom. All he wants to do, he's probably got some big clause in his contract that no one's actually seen. That he's going to get 20 million if he keeps them up, or he'll get like 10 if he doesn't. And everyone assumes he's going to keep them up, and then he's just going to take the money and run off to like, I don't know. The assumptions that I have around Allardyce of him just running off to like, I don't know, Marbella, and that
I
that video of him on the dance floor after he kept Sunderland up, which was brilliant.
I could see Big Sam doing that. But yeah, it kind of like, yeah. So system is all about, yeah, someone like Tony Pulis. I don't think would get the best out of Messi in his football, which is pretty obvious. Club is, some clubs in terms of the culture and where they are don't suit some
Yeah,
players. I think if you're coming from Barcelona, I think it could be quite tricky for you to go to a club maybe like Hull, in terms of maybe the city, not just about where it is in terms of the climate, but actually the city and the community that are there. And some of
yeah,
it's the player, right? Like, you might think Jesus Navas used to have severe homesickness as a youth. This is
yeah.
good. This is good knowledge as well.
It's good facts. Yeah,
Yeah, he used to have severe homesickness as a youth, and that scuppered a move to someone in Europe. I think it might have been Chelsea, like years and years ago. And then obviously he eventually moved to City and moved back. Now, if you don't really know that you actually are homesick, because you may not know, and then you opt to move, a good example is the late Reyes. where he came to
Yeah.
England and suddenly realized, oh, actually, I really miss Spain, I miss my friends. Part of that does come down to the player because I assume clubs like Arsenal really do try. They had other Spaniards there, maybe not then, but they had Fabregas coming through. But you part of you has to say, well, Fabregas came from Barcelona as a 15-year-old, settled. You didn't. That's not necessarily all on you, but the player is also part of this big kind of Venn diagram of the system, the club, and the player themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we assume just because they're elite footballers or elite sportsmen, that they're not like everyone else. They're not like you or I or the listener or whatever, who are, just human beings at the end of the day, and they do actually have have vulnerabilities. And so, as you said, Fabregas coming over at 15 shows his strength of character. To even someone like Bellerin comes over quite young from La Masia, and settles in, does quite well in terms of the football. They come through quite young. They go on to be professionals for the club and go on to have good careers. That's testament to their characters. Some players come to this country, or I mean, look at English players going abroad. It doesn't happen too often, and not many have done so well going abroad. So it's not just obviously club players coming to England specifically. In terms of this episode, obviously we're talking about Werner, but just generally moving across to another country. I mean, you're taken out of your comfort zone probably at a young age. And even if you're not at a young age, you've got a family who you might have to bring across. There's a lot of things that go around it, and people becoming homesick, or their families becoming homesick. And if you're 29, you've got a family of four, and they're in their teenage years or something like that. I mean, that would be, you'd have to have them quite young. But if they were like 10, around 10 years old or something like that, your kids, and you're having to uproot them to move across to another country to play football. These are all factors I think people don't, or people take for granted. And even just with domestic signings. So, I mean, with Sunderland, for example, Sunderland is so far away from a lot of cities. The Northeast in general is, other cities in the country. So, even places like the Northwest, it's good. You're talking a good 3-4 hours car journey. There's players that we've tried to sign in the past who didn't want to come or have opted to go to other teams because for them, they were already in that location, didn't want to relocate their family. Now, if you then apply that to someone coming from overseas, potentially from another continent.
So, kind of moving back to Werner, where do we kind of in this my lovely Venn diagram, which is imaginary for everyone that's listening, and for myself and for you, when we think about club, system, or player, where do we kind of think it lies with Werner? Obviously, he's got a lot of time. Premier League moves so quickly. For example, Arsenal 6 points off Chelsea. Yeah, we're having one of the worst seasons of all time. Tottenham were top of the league, and now people are saying, "Oh, well, it's looking terrible because they haven't won in a few games." So football can move very fast. If Werner scores 2 hat-tricks, everyone will leave him alone. But at this early stage, where do we kind of see it? So I kind of see it as like in my lovely Venn diagram, which I'm going to keep on mentioning. I see it as a system issue. I wouldn't say the club per se, because I feel in terms of Lampard, I don't think he's the right man to move Chelsea forward. I wouldn't say it's like a specific Lampard issue, potentially because Lampard affects the system. But I wouldn't say that as a club, Chelsea would be negative for Werner. I think he's got Kai Havertz there. Um, he's got Rudiger there.
Yeah, I suppose at this time, currently we would never know if it's the player himself because we don't know enough about him in terms of we might find out 3 years down the line if he was to leave, and we see something or a comment from a player, or Lampard retires early and brings out a book, and then we find out everything, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
What if it's about the player? I suppose they could announce it when they leave. I do think with this system, I would agree with you there. This kind of not necessarily negative start, but kind of just a kind of piecemeal start to his life in the Premier League, like compared to his numbers he had last season with Leipzig. As I said, he's not necessarily getting the same sort of opportunities he was at Leipzig. Perhaps people might say he's missed some chances this year, and he has. I've seen him miss chances. There's been criticisms of how he's been striking the ball, and says he's been hitting a lot of balls quite lofted, quite uh, clearing the crossbar on a few occasions. But I do think it's system. I do think him playing out wide left, and that inside forward role, when for a Chelsea team that don't necessarily press as highly as some of the other sides in the league, I do feel like he's better playing in behind, like a Vardy kind of character. He does
Mm.
remind me a lot of Vardy in terms of he's got blistering pace. He can finish one on one. He likes his finesse finishes. He does remind me of that sort of player. He's quite tenacious on the ball or when he's fighting for the ball. But if Vardy was to get the ball outside the box on the far left, it's unless he's played space for his shot, you'd probably expect to give it and get back in the penalty area or get around the penalty spot. With Werner playing out wide left, I feel as if he's kind of limited in that role, and I feel unless he moves centrally with Chelsea or he moves on, I'm hesitant to say that he'll recapture the numbers they did at Leipzig. But I could have said some very famous last words there.
Yeah, you don't want to get tweeted or quoted with that. But no, I do agree with you. The problem with Chelsea is that Werner's got a 5-year contract, I assume. So what's more likely to happen is Lampard will no longer be in the job by the time Werner sees out his contract. I don't know. It's quite an even one at the moment because Chelsea also they showed Murat at the door pretty quickly. Um, was probably at a similar sort of level, showing bits of what he can do, like Werner. So it
Yeah,
would be interesting to see how that kind of pans out. I think it is a system. I think that could change very easily depending on a change in management. And Chelsea love a change in management. It's like change.
yeah,
It's like changing shoes for them. So I think depending on how Lampard does, it remains to be seen. And Lampard may change as well. It's not as if one day a guy decides, okay, this is how I'll play you. Because Lampard, I think, has struggled in general of how he's going to fit all of his new toys into one system. And I think over time, players will leave, other players will shine a bit more, and you might think, oh, actually, this will suit X a bit more
yeah.
than what beforehand. So only time will tell. I so far have not been impressed enough to think he will recapture his Leipzig numbers, but I'm happy to be wrong on this one. That's all from us. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for listening to the chat. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.